The Thriving Child, where my speakers and I are discussing ways to get your child from frustrated and failing to focused and happy. I'm your host, Lyda Osinga, and my guest today is Melissa Schwarz. So let me read her wonderful bio. She was born an intense, sensitive, empathic power seeker. Her intuitive ability to decode misbehavior and her passion for giving a voice to the legitimate needs of children naturally evolved into becoming the co-creator of leading-edge parenting. She is a respected expert in the field of highly sensitive children and brings clarity, personal experience, and compassion for parents raising HSCs. So your bio says a little bit about how you became a parenting coach, but can you give us your story in more detail?
Yeah, sure. So the way that I became a parent coach was set in motion from my birth. I was born the second of two children. My older brother was a really easygoing baby, toddler, and because both of my parents are educators and my mom was an early childhood educator when she was working professionally, they sort of assumed that they knew what they were doing, and that's why my brother behaved the way that he did. Mm-hmm. And then I was born 4 years later, and nothing that worked with my brother worked with me. And so from the time that I was young, I'm told that I always sort of had this power-seeking streak, that I was always more sensitive than my peers. I had bigger emotional reactions than other people. And so when, pinning me against other children, it looked like something was up in my behavior that was off. And as I got older and I was in elementary and middle school, I sort of pushed boundaries with my teachers. My mom and I, we work together, and sometimes when we do talks together, we'll share the story of when I was in about like third or fourth grade. I was never a great speller. And one day on my spelling test, I decided to change how I spelled my name. And I put in an extra L. And I was just experimenting. And my teacher was very concerned that I didn't spell my name right on my spelling test, and approached my mom, who actually worked in my school at the time. And so I was then kind of tested for all sorts of learning differences, and my parents could never quite figure out what was up with me. Something was always just a little different than other kids, and always different than my brother, which was really the barometer for them. And I would say about 10 years ago, maybe a little more than that at this point, my mom and dad retired and they moved to California, and my mom wanted to continue teaching parents about understanding their children. And I said, let me help you with that. That sounds cool. And I was going with her to her workshops. And as she would talk about my brother and talk about me, parents started coming up to me at the end of the workshops and asking if they could talk to me because I sounded like their children. And that was when I realized, like, okay, so something else is going on here that people are identifying with, because I was never diagnosed with any learning differences. I was never diagnosed with any sensory processing disorder or anything like that. And yet as an adult, what I realized was that I am highly sensitive, and that is something that 1 in 5 people experience. It is a genetic trait. It is not a disorder. It is, it's a specific way of experiencing life, which makes emotions heightened. It amplifies our processing, our ability to interpret stimuli. And as you mentioned in my bio, I'm an energy reader. That means that I'm an empath. I can feel into other people's experiences. And as a child, I didn't know how to put words to what all of that was. And my parents weren't able to decipher through my behavior that that's what was going on. But over the years, as I've been working with parents and learning more about high sensitivity and sensory processing, I've actually realized that the things that made me challenging as a child are now what make me good at the work that I do as a parent coach. Because as an empath, I actually can feel into what is going on for a family. I can feel into a story and the participants in the story. And because I'm an adult who's worked with children, I can then translate that into action steps for parents to then show up differently for that child, or to interpret their behavior in new ways to really get to the root of it. So yeah, this has been in motion from my birth. And when my mom and I talk about it, we often say that this was predestined, and life really set us up perfectly for this journey together. And for me, it's just the most rewarding thing to take what as a child felt confusing, isolating, even shameful, and now shed light on it and use it as my gift to the world and to help other people. And like I said, it's 1 in 5 people that are highly sensitive. So it's more than 1 billion people currently on the planet. So for me to offer a little bit of insight for those people and the people who love them, who aren't highly sensitive, it's such a gift and a blessing.
Well, now you used a lot of words that we're not familiar with. And so can you explain the high sensitivity and the different variations that you are talking about?
Sure. So when we're talking about highly sensitive people, I first want to say that I am really referring to Dr. Elaine Aron's research. I always want to start with appreciating and thanking her because she really pioneered this understanding. She is a therapist living in the Bay Area in California, and in the mid-90s started to notice a correlation amongst her patients that she was working with, that there were some people who did experience things more intensely. They felt things deeper. They were more easily traumatized by life. And she started doing this research. And so it's really her research that I'm speaking to when I talk about this. And what she discovered is that it's 15 to 20% of the population. I want to say more current research is even saying it might be more than that. What I'm comfortable with is really saying 1 in 5 people. There is no gender discrimination. There is no cultural discrimination in the way that we see it manifesting. It shows up all over the world in equal numbers in men and women, boys and girls. We also see the trait of high sensitivity in more than 100 species of animals, including dogs, deer, fruit flies. I don't know how they measure sensitivity in fruit flies, but apparently there were studies done. And so what we know is that there is an evolutionary benefit for this trait showing up in this ratio, because even in animals, it's 1 in 5. So it's about 20% of the population. And the reason why I personally believe things are exactly as they're supposed to be is because if everyone was highly sensitive, if everyone was deeply empathic, we would constantly be stepping back and evaluating and making sure other people were comfortable and their needs were met, and the world might slow to a halt. In other words, too much high sensitivity will throw off the balance. And yet, if there were no highly sensitive people, we would live in a world that was lacking in terms of empathy, compassion, creativity, artistry. The professions that highly sensitive people gravitate towards are things like artists, artisans, therapists, healers, teachers, coaches, musicians. In other words, there's a specific niche for the highly sensitive person in the world. And this 1 in 5 ratio is just right. When I do talks in person, when I ask how many people, and I'll share with you more the specific traits of high sensitivity in a minute, when I ask how many people think they may be highly sensitive or have highly sensitive children, I want to say it's usually about 30 or 40% of the hands that go up in the room. And I think that's because those people are asking. In other words, they're out there looking. They're looking for the answers. They're looking to know that there's nothing wrong with them. And yet, what we see across the board is really this 1 in 5. So for educators, people that are listening that work with children, expect to have in a classroom of 20 or 30 children, 4, 5, 6 children that are highly sensitive, that have bigger needs, bigger emotions. They're taking in more information through their senses. There are 4 qualities, 4 traits that all highly sensitive people have. Elaine Aron coined a term, DOES. So I'm going to explain what those stand for. So the D stands for depth of processing. And that speaks to how deeply we process experiences, emotions, events, films, conversations. It might also speak to, especially in younger children who kind of hang back and observe before they get involved. In other words, feeling the energy of a room before walking into it, or feeling out the people at a party before you kind of begin to engage. That deep processing is found in all highly sensitive people. The second one, the O, speaks to overstimulation. And that happens because we take in so much information, we process so deeply that we can overprocess, we can overstimulate, we can have too much of a good thing. And so it's really important for highly sensitive adults to learn how to modulate their levels, how to be really aware of how they're feeling so they don't dip into overwhelm and have to be overwhelmed or overstimulated before they notice it. A lot of times with highly sensitive children, parents struggle to read that child's cues. And when the child is in overwhelm, they'll have a tantrum, and then we know that something is up. And the real key is to catch it before they get there, so that way they can avoid really dipping into that big overwhelm. But I want to say it's quite common for sensitive people. And a wise, sensitive adult who is just hearing this for the first time will look into, well, what do I do to take care of myself? You might want to do meditation. I practice yoga. There are all sorts of self-care routines that you can engage in that will help you become less overstimulated. And of course, mindfulness practices help us check in to see how are we feeling throughout the day so that we can be aware of our levels before we're in that full boil kind of moment. The E in that anagram, not the right word, acronym, is speaks to emotional sensitivity. And the way that I like to explain it is neurotypical people, so the 4 and 5 that are not highly sensitive, they experience emotions like this. It's kind of a narrow spectrum. So this is sadness and this is happiness. The highly sensitive person, I'm going to get off the screen, but over here is sort of sadness and depression and hopelessness and joy and ecstasy and elation. In other words, the emotional spectrum is broader. There's, if you think about a box of Crayola crayons, you could get the 12-pack or the 96-pack, right? The highly sensitive person has 96 colors, 90, right? While the neurotypical person has 12. There are more emotions to choose from as a highly sensitive person, and that speaks to the positive and the negative. So it's really a double-edged sword. In other words, when highly sensitive people get the reins on their sensitivity and they feel empowered and understand the way that they're moving through life and they feel in control of it, they can access all of those joyful feelings, and life is really, really good. And unfortunately, for many sensitive people, they don't grow up with the tools, or they experience so much trauma, shame. In other words, they have a really hard time that they end up hanging out in those uncomfortable feelings, and they get to experience all of them. And the real beauty of being highly sensitive is knowing that you can dip in and out of all of it, and it's always okay, that this is just part of your colorful experience as a sensitive person. You get to access more of what life offers. And I want to say the fourth piece, that the S, speaks to sensing the subtleties. And that really talks about noticing energy. Sometimes we talk about feeling good vibes or bad vibes. A lot of the families that I work with, their children will often say things to their parents like, I don't want to go to that house, or I don't like to play with that friend. In other words, that child is telling us very clearly that they are picking up on something subtle that's going on that doesn't feel good to them, or that does feel good to them, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes a child will gravitate towards one adult that might be a stranger. I'm that person at airports that parents are always handing that crying baby to, right? Because I'm safe and they can feel it, right? The children gravitate towards that energy. They can really feel what's going on with other people. So those four commonalities are experienced by every highly sensitive person. That is really what kind of brings the umbrella in that term. I want to also say that some highly sensitive people experience one of those more intensely than others. So for example, some may be very emotionally sensitive, but they don't process all that deeply. Or some may be really deep processors, but they might not really be energy readers and notice subtleties. They might not be very empathic. So the degree in which each of those four aspects shows up can vary, but generally speaking, all four of those are showing up in a highly sensitive person.
In some way or form is what
Exactly.
You're saying. Yeah. So what does a highly sensitive child look like? What would a parent be going, okay, here's a red flag, and maybe not even a red flag. I guess what I'm thinking is, why is my child highly sensitive? What would be the things that they would look for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I want to say starting off in the earlier years, in these infancy months, these children may not want to be held by strangers. They may struggle to find their rhythms. In other words, they may cry a lot. They they generally are noticing what's going on around them. They might be real sensitive to the fabrics that they're swaddled in. They may not want to be swaddled at all. They may need specific movements. They may not like movements. In other words, they're fussier. We call them the difficult babies. They're challenging, right? They may struggle with breastfeeding or bottle feeding to latch. I want to just interrupt and say that in these very early infancy years, those indicators that I'm sharing may also indicate sensory processing disorder, which is a little bit different from high sensitivity. Now, I want to say high sensitivity, being highly sensitive, the term that we use for what highly sensitive people have is sensory processing sensitivity. That's the sort of medical term for it, but it's not a diagnosis. It's not a disorder. There's no medication. There's no treatment. It's like saying, oh, I have blue eyes or I have green eyes. It's like, okay, cool. That's what's going on for you. So being highly sensitive or having sensory processing sensitivity is not something to be fixed. There's nothing wrong. It is just a certain way of experiencing life based on those characteristics. Now, I want to say sensory processing disorder speaks to some neurological disordering in the way the sensory systems are interpreted by the brain. So very often in the first year of life, highly sensitive children and children with sensory processing disorder may display some of the same behaviors. So I want to say that in either case, if in that first year of life, those infancy months and when we're starting to talk about rolling over, crawling, tummy time, beginning to eat and taking solids, once you start bathing the baby, there are certain things that we're looking for in terms of behaviors. Now, if a child struggles with tummy time, or they don't crawl, or they don't take to different food textures, or they don't want to try foods, that indicates to me some sensory processing disorder. In other words, that is a little bit beyond this sensory processing sensitivity. The highly sensitive infant is more fussy and particular, but they're still meeting their milestones appropriately. When we get into that toddler range, I want to say the highly sensitive toddler is usually called a toddler with the terrible twos, because most of the time they won't listen, they push back, they want to do it themselves, or they want mommy or they want daddy. In other words, they're usually very controlling and dominating. And if you don't understand that they're highly sensitive, they can be very challenging to be with. Their favorite word might be no. They might have a lot of tantrums. In the preschool years, a lot of that behavior will continue. They may be very aesthetically picky. In other words, they might want to wear a specific shirt, or it has to be that lunchbox. Most of the time, the biggest indicator for pulling out high sensitivity is a child who feels things deeply. For me, that is one of the most common things that I see in the first 5 years. So they're feeling their emotions deeply. Now, I want to say most young children feel things deeply, but there are different degrees, right? These are the kids that are having breakdowns often. It's really hard to get them to stop something and do something else. Transitioning between activities is notoriously difficult for sensitive children. I want to also say that Elaine Aron wrote a wonderful book called The Highly Sensitive Child, and I often refer it out to clients because I couldn't write a better book, so that's that is the one for people to read. And in the beginning of her book, and also on her website, she's created a questionnaire. It's about 20 or 30 questions that have a bunch of true-false statements that any parent, educator, or professional can take a look at. And I would really encourage just to get familiar with the things that she's put on there. It's mostly the things that I've shared. But you can go through and take this assessment. And if one or two things on this list are really true of your child, it's assumed that they're highly sensitive. Otherwise, I think it's if they mark about 10 or 12 of the items on the list out of the 30, something like that, then we can assess that they are highly sensitive. Again, I want to say that there is no formal diagnosis because there's nothing to be treated here. So most of the time when I'm working with parents with sensitive children, they can usually intuit it, or the parent themselves says, oh, maybe I'm highly sensitive. Actually, that kind of sounds like me when I was a child. And I want to say high sensitivity stays with us our whole life. So if you were sensitive as a child, you will still be sensitive as an adult. The goal is to be empowered in your sensitivity, to really understand how to harness it for the magic that it provides. Yeah, I'll leave that there.
Well, and it's really important. I know as you're talking, we're all probably thinking of people we know or that are highly sensitive. I mean, if you think 1 out of 5, that's a lot of people that we know.
Sure.
And I'm sure we had other labels that we put on them.
And I want to just say that it's quite common for highly sensitive adults and children to be labeled with things like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, ADD, ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder. I can't even tell you how many children I've worked with diagnosed with ODD who were highly sensitive and, I'm going to say, misdisciplined, because a highly sensitive child who feels controlled, who looks at the authorities in their life as hypocrites, will absolutely become defiant by the time they're in school. I see it over and over and over again. And the root of a lot of these disorders, which are actually secondary, the root is the high sensitivity. And when the high sensitivity is misunderstood, it is very common for these secondary disorders to show up. But they are actually a manifestation of the sensitivity not being understood.
So it would be of a great benefit to parents to take a look at the sensitivity questionnaire and see how quickly or how much their child fits that before going another route and seeing if they're ADD. Oh man, that's important.
Yeah, it's so important. I've worked with countless families whose children were on medication for ADD. And once we realized that they weren't able to focus, not because they couldn't focus, but because when I was talking about sensing the subtleties, think back to when you were in a classroom as a child. The overhead fluorescent lights, they cast a color, which would give me a headache personally. Or sometimes you hear that buzz of the lights, or the hum of a refrigerator, or the ticking of a clock. Or I remember being in school and kids would click their pens, and that would just drive me crazy. And I couldn't focus on the teacher because that kid was clicking his pen. And so I might present as ADD when in fact I'm just taking in so much stimuli and I'm having a hard time filtering it out.
Okay, so what are some strategies that you would recommend to help parents grow their children into emotionally healthy adults?
Isn't that the money question?
I know. We don't have that much time, but maybe an idea of where to go.
Yeah, so I want to give one really concrete tip that will work for all children, especially for the sensitive child. Validate the emotion behind the behavior. In other words, so often I hear from parents, how do I get my kid to stop doing this? Or how do I get them to start doing that? And we're talking about specific behaviors. But we forget to look at what is going on for that child, that they are doing that annoying behavior or they are not doing the thing that we want them to do. There's always an emotional component underneath it. And so I would always encourage parents, number one, to take a deep breath before responding to your child. The physiological reason for that is because when you are triggered by something that your child has done, you're in your limbic system, which doesn't allow you access to your frontal lobe of your brain, where all of your thinking and rational logic is accessible. And so we want to first calm ourselves so that we can get there. And then you want to say to your child something like this: it looks to me like you are feeling blank. And then label the emotion that you see in your child. This works really well for young children. Older children might roll their eyes at you because they're thinking that you're a hypocrite, that now you care about their emotions. So go into it knowing that. But if you can begin to label the child's emotions, help them identify what they're feeling. I love to say to parents, when kids are younger, we teach them letters. We say, this is an A, and then we go out into the world and we see an A in the store. We say, oh, look, that's an A, or, oh, A, that's your name, Adam. Adam starts with A. And we help them identify this concept out in the world. We want to do that with emotions. We want to help children have emotional literacy in that same way. They learn to identify emotions by recognizing it when they feel it. So we want to say to them, you are feeling angry right now. You say to your 3-year-old, you are feeling angry. You threw your toy at daddy because you are so angry that daddy said it was time to clean up and take a bath. You're so angry. I see your face all scrunched up. In other words, and then when you take that child to the playground and another child throws a toy, you say, ooh, that child looks angry too. Why do you think that child is so angry? In other words, we want to help children begin to identify what emotions look like out in the wild, out in the world. Think back to the box of Crayola crayons. The same way that we would show that child, this is brown, that's brown, this is black, this is black. In other words, we show them out in the world. We want to do that with emotions. That's the way that children begin to recognize what they're feeling. And then they can use that language to express themselves rather than it just coming out in their behavior.
You know, that's a really important thing to realize, because I think back and, you know, for me, we were always supposed to keep a very narrow, you can't be angry, you can't be happy, you just have to be calm. And I see the benefit, especially with the kids I work with, to make them realize, okay, it's okay to be this emotion. You need to understand it.
Yes. And then we can teach them what to do with it, because it is okay to feel angry. It's not okay to hit. It's not okay to throw. It's not okay to say those mean things. It is okay to hit a baseball with a bat. It is okay to go out into the woods and yell. It is okay to go to karate and chop some wood with your hand. In other words, we want to help these children make peace with all of their emotions and learn what to do when they experience them in a healthy, constructive way.
Wow, that is really powerful. So what are some recommendations you have for teachers in the classroom when they're faced with the highly sensitive child?
It's a great question. So for teachers of younger children, I encourage setting up what I like to call a cozy corner, or you could call it like a calm down corner. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a corner, but a place with maybe soft pillows or stuffed animals, maybe some dim lighting, some calming books, maybe some sensory toys like those water toys that you can turn, or things to squish. Children that are highly sensitive tend to be what we call over-responsive to sensory input. And so they usually feel good to fidget or hug things. That's one way that they can calm themselves down. Having a quiet space that a child can put themselves in when they are feeling close to overwhelm teaches them how to calm themselves down. It helps them know that there's nothing wrong with them for feeling that way. And here's a resource to handle it, right? So a teacher of young children could absolutely say, Samantha, you're so angry that Johnny took your toy that you just hit him. We don't hit each other. You can tell him that you're angry. You can go calm down for a few minutes. And eventually she will learn through having that loving reminder that she can calm herself down before she feels like she needs to hit. Right? This is the way that we actually teach them, because so often I hear parents and teachers and well-meaning adults saying, use your words, take a breath and calm down. But we actually can't even do it in that moment. You know, like we're the ones who are frantic. And so rather than sort of intellectualizing what it looks like to take a breath and use our words, create a space for the children to be able to do that. That's a really wonderful thing. For teachers with older children, you know, if you're in an older classroom, I want to say at that point, a lot of stuff is already in motion. There's usually a lot of momentum. But the thing that every sensitive child responds to, every child, but especially the sensitive one, is feeling seen, that connection, right? And so as a teacher, I know the days are stretched and the demands are grueling and the expectations are outrageous. And yet the best thing that you can do is to slow down and take 30 seconds and connect with that child and see them, to validate something wonderful and special and precious in them, and slowly build this relationship so that child feels seen and safe. When children have those relationships, they don't have to act out in the ways that they do when they don't feel seen and safe. And I want to say teachers it's an uphill battle, because what goes on in the home sets up so much of the behavior that goes on for children. And so that's why one of the most effective things teachers of older children can do is create a safe space. You know, if you can do that in these little snippets with a child over the course of a year, you can really affect them in a deeply profound way.
And you know, you hear a lot of people saying, use your words, but you are adding say that you're the emotion and then use your words. And I find that to be extremely powerful, because it's not just about using your words, like, give me back my toy. It's like, I'm angry because I want my toy back, or something like that.
Yeah, I feel angry that you took my toy. Friends don't take toys from each other, right? That's really what we want to say. And so the way that a child learns that sort of language is by the adults modeling it for them. And if we model it for them enough, and I say to every client I work with that has children under 7, it's the first 5 to 7 years where they're learning this stuff. They do not know it in these years. It takes all of these years of repetition and patience and willingness to be loving and compassionate that these children they're learning so much in these years that the emotional stuff is going to take a little bit longer. It's hard for adults to do this emotional stuff. We're asking a 2-year-old to be able to do it. They're not even potty trained. How are they going to be able to handle their emotions, right? So if we can do this over and over and over with them, by the time they're 7, they are masters of it. It's unbelievable. And I do want to say it's intense, and it is grueling, and it is deeply, deeply rewarding.
Well, and I see so many unhealthy children in my classrooms now. I really feel that parents need to have tools to make sure that their child can navigate this world out there now.
Yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely. That's why I'm so impassioned to do this.
Yeah, well, we've learned so much in the time we've got. So can you talk to us about some of the projects that you have going forward? I mentioned a book, and then we also have a free gift for the parents that are tuned in.
Yeah. So I'll start with the free gift, which is my mom and I wrote an ebook that we are giving away, and it's called Emotionally Healthy Discipline. And I want to say that ebook, it's wonderful for educators. Also, there's some great specific language tips to use in there. And what my mom and I, sorry, I apologize.
Oh, I said I did download it, and I'm using it in my classroom.
Oh, yay. So. Cool. I love that. Yeah. And so what we did in that ebook was we really wanted to just get right to the strategies, because that's what parents always want. So, so that is free. That's our free gift that parents and professionals can download. And then the other gift that I'm offering is a free private coaching session with me, in which we can kind of dive into a specific challenge, or if somebody's wondering if their child is highly sensitive, if there's maybe some sensory processing disorder going on, if you're not sure if something is up in your child, I'm happy to help you assess what might be going on. And then I also wanted to share, kind of on that note, that one of my projects is this book that I wrote that will be out in August. It's called Under the Hood, and it is a manual to understanding the inner workings of children. And essentially what I do in this book with my co-author, Jill Loftus, who's a pediatric occupational therapist and one of my best friends for 10 years, what we do is we bring our work together here, and we look at high sensitivity and sensory processing disorder and break down from gestation through the first 5 years, what these behaviors look like, different indicators of red flag behaviors, what is high sensitivity, what is SPD, what is the overlap. And the really exciting thing is that we actually coin a new term in this book, which is SPSD, which stands for sensory processing, sensitivity, and disorder, and speaks to the children that have both SPS and SPD. And then we offer strategies and solutions to support those children both at home and in the classroom, so that they can thrive and feel empowered. So for me, that is the most exciting project these days.
Well, it's a great title, and I can't wait to read it myself, because it sounds like a lot of information. So, well, thank you so much for this interview. I can't believe how much we've learned in 30 minutes. So I definitely want to encourage people to get onto your website and to look through your information. And even if they don't think their child is highly sensitive, I'm sure the information is so important for anyone who is feeling frustration and tantrums and anger, I would think.
Absolutely. I always say the things that I teach, the strategies I teach for highly sensitive children, they work for all children. It's just that highly sensitive children need more. And so it's a little more specific for them, but every child benefits from the strategies that I teach.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a great interview. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.